Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221 Shakespeare, where we are in the midst of talking about Macbeth. Today is the 26th of April. Believe it or not, we have 2 weeks left of the semester, just enough time to do Othello. And you might have noticed that we've been behind in our course outline, but I didn't have much scheduled for our last week. I wanted to talk a little bit about The Tempest as an extra credit play, and I also had a catch-up day. So this is how we will be able to finish Othello in its entirety and then have at least a little bit of time to talk about The Tempest for those of you who are interested in that play. But again, that is not a requirement for the class. But if you wanted to earn some extra credit, a couple of ways you could do so is by handing in a journal about The Tempest, or for the final examination, I will be including a question about The Tempest for additional points. So it would be possible to earn over 100 points on the exam. So, talking about the final and some upcoming assignments, journal number 5 for Macbeth is going to be due today if you are watching this video on the 26th, which is Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF, as always, to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I'm sorry I was having some technical difficulties last class, but I posted a video that I had recorded in a previous semester about Macbeth, where I was talking a bit about the play holistically, and today I wanted to talk about quotation so that you could utilize all of those elements in your journal for this evening if you so wanted to. And of course, if you need an extension, you can ask me. The final exam, and there is a final exam for this class, it is scheduled, and this is the time that our exam would be if we were meeting on Monday and Wednesday at 8 o'clock, which would be the face-to-face meeting time equivalent of this class. So that would be our final exam Monday, 5:15 at 8 a.m. So if we were taking this exam face-to-face, you would have 2 hours to take the exam. What I'm going to do is to give you 24 hours to take the exam since you are doing it online. And it is open book, open notes. That would be the same whether the class was face-to-face or online. So if I post the exam on the 15th at 8 a.m., then it would be due 24 hours later. It will be an essay examination where you will have a series of essays from which to choose to respond, and also some explications. Basically, you will be given some examples of quotation and you'll be asked to analyze those quotes and talk about their importance. And again, you'll have choice within the exam. And it is open book, open notes, so you can utilize things like your former writing assignments, such as your journals or your papers. As you know, your second paper is going to be due at the very ending of the semester. And that's not to preclude you from handing it in earlier, but I wanted to make sure that you had the entire semester as an option for your second paper. As you know, paper number 1 was devoted to the comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. So paper number 2 will be devoted to either Richard II, Macbeth, or Othello. And I always think about Richard II at this time in the semester, and one of my favorite quotes, "I've wasted time, and now time doth waste me," is I always feel this sense of anxiety about time towards the ending of the semester. But we do have enough time to talk about both Macbeth and Othello. In terms of talking about Macbeth, this play has perhaps some of Shakespeare's most famous quotes. I'm always tempted when we get to Macbeth to say that this is my favorite Shakespearean play, although I must admit I feel that temptation with every play. But in my mind, Macbeth has it all. As you know, I've talked about how I'm interested in the Gothic, and definitely Macbeth is very much a Gothic text. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why I enjoy Macbeth so much. And the Royal Shakespeare Company production that we saw, it is superb with Ian McClellan. One of the things I really find fascinating is to have Ian McClellan, who's now Sir Ian McClellan, talk a little bit about his inspiration when he was doing the role. And it's wonderful to hear an actor sort of process how they go about thinking about stating lines, which is why I offered that to you last class to hear a little bit about the actor's performance. In terms of quotes, you can see that in the notes below. I've indicated several. That's not to say that this is an all-inclusive list, but the play begins right at the very beginning. Act 1, Scene 1, line 11. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. In other words, things are not what they appear. And also there is this sense of equivocation that we're not going to get necessarily the clarity of truth. And those elements, I think, help to bring about the sense of supernatural and mystery to this play that it's so famous for. I also like the British Broadcasting Corporation's portrayal of the witches. I find them to be downright eerie as they're shrieking and screaming there. At the time of the Renaissance, witches would have been seen as real entities, or at least the possibility of real entities, much like fairies. So certainly there are lots of ways that we can analyze Macbeth, and we could talk about the witches as perhaps a subconscious personification of his desires. But certainly they seem to be, or would have been viewed to be, real entities during the time that this play occurred. And of course, the witches, they give their prophecies. It almost reminds me of a Twilight Zone episode. If you happen to be a friend of or a fan of the Twilight Zone, which I am. And what we get is the literal truth, but of course, it's a truth that comes with a twist. And the initial prophecy in the first act, Act 1, Scene 1, or Act 1, Scene 3, I'm sorry, lines 65, 66, and 67. Notice we're given 3 prophecies. 3 is such an important number in the play. 3 represents Trinity, Christian Trinity, but also unholy Trinity when we talk about the 3 witches. It also talks about this idea of past, present, and future. Lesser than Macbeth and greater is Act 1, Scene 3, line 65. Not so happy, yet much happier. Act 1, Scene 3, line 66. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. Act 1, Scene 3, line 67. So this is for Banquo, and notice that he is immediately suspicious. After all, the prophecy is coming from witches with a reputation of being evil. That said, we know that Macbeth immediately jumps on the idea of the prophecies of how he could one day be king. And this idea of being in borrowed robes, which we see in Act 1, Scene 3, line 108. We've seen before how Shakespeare oftentimes uses fashion and clothing for thematic statements. We saw this with Benedict, for instance, in Much Ado About Nothing, where he was becoming quite foppish because of the superficial trappings of fashion. Now that he was in love, he had lost his ability to reason, or at least that was one of the messages embedded within the play. And we also know that Shakespeare likes metadrama. He likes to be very meta in his writing, and he likes to draw parallels to the fact that we are watching a play and that we are reading a play and that he's a playwright. We're told in Act 1, Scene 3, line 128, that this is a happy prologue to the swelling act. Of course, a direct commentary on the idea that a play is divided into acts. And while Macbeth initially considers that the supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good, I notice that equivocation there in Act 1, Scene 3, line 130, he almost immediately jumps to the conclusion, despite the thought in Act 1, Scene 3, line 142, if chance will have me king, why chance may crown me without my stir. Yet he feels emboldened to write a letter to Lady Macbeth. Of course, we know she's his greatest partner in greatness, so perhaps, or his dearest partner in greatness, so perhaps that makes a certain level of sense. But if the Macbeths, as I call them, are indeed that close, he probably knows very well that this letter will motivate Lady Macbeth to encourage Macbeth to do what he probably wanted to do all along, which was to take direct action in order to gain the kingdom. It's one of the things that I've asked you to contemplate in the attendance questions. The idea of how much was Macbeth tempted by witches as outside forces, and how much was it about Macbeth's own inner flaw or flaws in character, his ambition, his greed. And you probably notice how short these acts are. This is a very fast moving play. I think that's very important, just to show how quickly one can descend into evil, and one evil act leads to another, leads to another. It basically snowballs. There's no way to stop the evil once it begins. Of course, we know by this point King James also would have been in power rather than Queen Elizabeth. King James was fond of shorter plays, so there is a practical reason for a shorter Macbeth. King James was also quite interested in the idea of the supernatural, so it makes sense that we have a play about the supernatural. And of course, Macbeth is about the Scottish king, which of course is related to King James's lineage. So we know that Shakespeare's not above being a business person in terms of flattery and making sure that not only are his audiences satisfied, but more importantly, his patrons and the political powers at play at that point. So, as we know that Macbeth considers Act 1, Scene 4, line 49, that this is a step on which I must fall down or else o'erleap. This is where it comes to the conclusion that he's got to kill Duncan in order to be able to take Duncan's position. And this is when he writes in Act 1, Scene 5, line 11, my dearest partner in greatness. And of course, Lady Macbeth is a strong female character. It's something that we didn't see with Richard II because it was very much a political world. This is a political world, but it also is a world that involves female. The fact that we've got evil female is somewhat complicated, but nevertheless, we do have female. And we know that Lady Macbeth is concerned that her husband doesn't have the manliness in order to be able to take action. And this is how she attacks him, through his conception of what it means to be a man. And of course, since Macbeth is an established warrior, after all, he's defeated a traitor at the beginning of the play. Quite ironic that he becomes a traitor as the play progresses. But we know that this is a very effective technique that Lady Macbeth uses in order to urge Macbeth to take action. And she says in Act 1, Scene 5, line 16, yet I do fear thy nature is too full of the milk of human kindness. And milk, of course, comes with all kinds of associations with motherhood and with suckling, which we'll talk a little bit later about when we talk about Lady Macbeth's perhaps most famous speech, Come on, sex me here. And also this idea of nature and what is natural and what is unnatural. And the witches definitely are unnatural, and they offer prophecies, especially towards the ending of the play, that are unnatural. The woods can't move against you, for instance. None of woman born, of course, that's unnatural, but we see how ultimately the seed of truth is in there as well, so that Macbeth is easily manipulated. And the difference, of course, is at the beginning of the play, the witches come to Macbeth. By the ending of the play, Macbeth goes to the witches. So there's been a transformation in his character. Just like we see a transformation from a very strong Lady Macbeth at the beginning of the play to a much weaker Macbeth, or a much weaker Lady Macbeth out damn spot, where ultimately the guilt overcomes her and as she commits suicide. So, this idea of transitioning or trading places, transformation. And so at this point, even though we've read just a few of Shakespeare's plays and a few of his sonnets, we're already beginning to see a repetition of themes. And of course, that very famous speech that I was talking about, Act 1, Scene 5, line 41, when Lady Macbeth says, come unsex me here. I wanted to read that to you. And if I can find it, I'm sorry, just give me a moment. Act 1, Scene 5. I just lost my place. Act 1, Scene 5, line 16. Yet I do fear thy nature is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. Notice the images of illness, death, and decay that we see in the tragedies that we haven't seen in the comedies. We began to see them in the histories. After all, the history we read was the tragedy of Richard II. But now it's come full force. And when Lady Macbeth says, ultimately, come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. So that's line 41. Come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe topful of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood. Stop the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, nor keep peace between the effect and it. Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk and gall, you murthering ministers. Wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief, come thick night, and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold. How much of this takes place in the dark? It's so different from the scenes that we saw when we were reading and watching the comedies that were filled with celebration. The banqueting that occurs in Macbeth is a kind of reverse banqueting. In fact, this is how King Duncan is ultimately killed at a time when he's supposed to be safe because he is being honored by a kinsman and also by one of his subjects. We see how ultimately that's laid to rest quite quickly when the Macbeths, both of them, hatch their plot. And we know that Lady Macbeth is able to manipulate Macbeth in many ways. And one of the things she says to him, Act 1, Scene 7, line 48 to 58, what beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me? This idea of you told me this because you wanted me to encourage you. And there really isn't any evidence to disprove that. Now, Macbeth talks about how she's filled with such strength and manliness that she should bring forth men children only. Act 1, Scene 7, line 73. Lady Macbeth is quite unnatural when she talks about that she would basically she would basically find a way to bash in the brains of the suckling babe and do what's unnatural. So when we see this, perhaps we are not too surprised about the consequences, and this play very much is about consequences. Macbeth, at points, seems like he might be hallucinating, but at other points, it seems like he might be experiencing supernatural phenomenon. Both might be possible at the same time. His very famous speech in Act 2, Scene 1, line 33 to 64, is this a dagger I see before me? Which, by the way, if you are a fan of Robin Williams, he does a wonderful stand-up routine where he recites this speech where he ultimately is using a John Wayne voice in the way that only Robin Williams can do. So I always think about that when I think about this particular speech. And, of course, in Act 2, Scene 2, line 26, I could not say amen. This idea that the consequences of the actions means a loss of spirituality. This is a knocking, jittery, nervous kind of play. We hear a lot of knocking. For instance, in Act 2, Scene 2, line 54, with the question of, whence is that knocking? And, of course, it's bad enough that we know that Lady Macbeth wants to bash in the brains of the suckling babe. But the drunken porter scene might be perhaps one of the only places where we get a little bit of humor. This is a relentless play in many ways. It's a very dark play. We know that Shakespeare likes to give us lower level characters who oftentimes illustrate insight, which is exactly what we're going to see in Act 2, Scene 3, when we hear the drunken porter talk a little bit. And of course, his speech is going to be very appropriate thematically. And the porter says, "Here's a knocking indeed. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he should have old turning the key." So this is Scene 3 of Act 2. "Knock, knock, knock. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub?" "Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time. Have napkins enough about you. Here you'll swear for it." "Knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name?" "Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven." "Oh, come in, equivocator." "Knock, knock, knock. Who's there?" "Faith, here's an English tailor, come thither for stealing out a French hose. Come in, tailor. Here you may roast your goose." "Knock, knock." Never a quiet. "What are you? But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further. I thought to have let in some of all professions that go the primrose way." So if you've ever heard the primrose way, now you know where it comes from. "To the everlasting bonfire. I pray you, remember the porter." Of course, he mentions three. Again, that idea of three is something that we will see repeated throughout the course of the play. The first is a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. This is Macbeth, who is basically hanging himself or hurting himself, destroying himself on the expectation of plenty, on the expectation that he shall be king. "Come in time, have napkins enough about you. Here you'll swear for it." "Knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name?" "Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale." Now, I talked about how this play is basically about equivocation, and that's definitely what the witches are doing as well. "Knock, knock. Who's there?" "An English tailor come hither for stealing out a French hose." And that's basically what Macbeth does, is that Macbeth steals the position of king. Of course, we see that clothing imagery as well, and the idea that the robes don't fit very well. Where the porter continues on and talks a little bit about drunkenness. "Marry, sir, nose painting, sleep, and urine." And talking about what drunkenness provokes. "Lechery, sir, provokes, but unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but takes away the performance. Therefore much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It makes him and it mars him. It sets him on, it takes him off. It persuades him and disheartens him. Makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep, and giving him the lie, leaves him." And there are all kinds of sexual references here about how alcohol provokes desire, but it prevents the fulfillment of desire. In other words, attacking manhood. And that's the theme that we've seen with Lady Macbeth as she's attacking Macbeth throughout the course of the play, his manhood. But this idea of being impotent is something that is central within the course of the play, or the fear of being impotent. And when we're told the night has been unruly in Act 2, Scene 3, line 54, might I suggest this whole play is about things that are unruly. A subject is not supposed to kill their king. Keep in mind again that the king is supposed to be the God anointed and ultimately is second only to God. And as we go on, we see how unnatural the events have become. Act 2, Scene 3, line 54, where we see that nature itself is in discord. And we've seen this before in, let's say, something like A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the arguments of the fairies have been so severe that nature itself was in discord. But in Act 2, Scene 4, and line 10 to 19, we hear a little bit about the unnatural events that have been occurring. And Again, that's in line 10. "'Tis unnatural, even like the deed that's done. On Tuesday last, a falcon towering in her pride of place was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. And Duncan's horses, a thing most strange and certain, beauteous and swift, the minions of their race, turned wild in nature, broke their stalls, flung out, contending against obedience as they would make war with mankind. And they did so to the amazement of my eyes. They were said to eat each other." That idea of cannibalism is something that we saw with Richard II as well. The only other place that I can think of where you might be able to find a little bit of humor, at least I find it humorous. I don't know if you find it humorous. But by this point, of course, the murder's been completed. You can either say that Lady Macbeth is weak because she wasn't able to kill herself because she said that it reminded her too much of her father. Or it could be that Lady Macbeth is brilliant and able to manipulate Macbeth so that she didn't have to get her hands bloody, literally. But of course, we know the out damn spot speech means that, at least from a symbolic perspective, the guilt will always be there. But of course, by this point, we're in Act 3 of the play, the pinnacle of the play, and now it looks like Macbeth is being haunted either by a guilty conscience or by the ghost of Banquo, or perhaps both. And Lady Macbeth says in Act 3, Scene 4, line 66, "Why do you make such faces? When all's done, you look but on a stool." And for some reason, I find that to be very funny. I don't know why, but I do. And of course, this is when Macbeth makes the decision. Act 3, Scene 4, line 131. And this is so important. "I will tomorrow to the Weird Sisters." Now, he's going to seek out the evil. So we could debate back and forth as to whether or not the Weird Sisters, the three witches, were an outside force, whether Lady Macbeth was an outside force, how much Macbeth was cajoled and manipulated. Would Macbeth have taken action without those two elements? But we definitely know by this point of the play, he's taking action on his own. And of course, he's told to beware Macduff. So the way that Macbeth translates this is that he's going to have to eliminate Macduff. Act 4, Scene 1, line 171. Or line 71, I'm sorry. Act 4, Scene 1, line 71. And Macbeth is also told, "None of woman born shall harm Macbeth." Act 4, Scene 1, line 80. Of course, Macbeth thinks he's safe because there is no such thing, unless you want to think about a cesarean section, an unnatural birth. Again, that goes back to the idea of natural and unnatural. And then the last prophecy, of course, again, 3, Act 4, Scene 1, line 92. "Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." Of course, the way that that comes to fruition in Act 4, Scene 1, line 92, is that the soldiers camouflage themselves as trees. And that ultimately means that Birnam Wood can come to destroy Macbeth, or the natural world can come to destroy the unnatural ruler, if you wanted to think about it that way. And we know that Shakespeare is going to take an opportunity to make sure that the new king in place is appeased and satisfied. So there's a scene that would seem to not be terribly important, that oftentimes is read as just a way for Shakespeare to show a little bit of flattery to King James. Never a bad idea. And this is where we have Macduff, who's testing Malcolm's loyalty. Of course, things don't look good because after King Duncan is killed, his sons run off, assuming that they're going to be the next targets, but that just makes them seem even more guilty. So Macduff, of course, leaves his wife, and by this point, Macbeth has become, this was a term that actually one of my older, or one of my former professors had used, a killing machine, quote unquote, when he basically is killing randomly at this point. If he can't get Macduff, well, he'll take Macduff's family. It's all in the same as far as he's concerned. But nevertheless, when Macduff is testing Malcolm's loyalty, because Macduff realizes that he needs to protect the kingdom, so that means that he needs to leave his nuclear family and allow them to be vulnerable, which is why they're slain. Act 4, Scene 3, line 148. where we're told that the king, where Malcolm is known for his healing abilities. And the thought is that this was Shakespeare's way of saying that King James was also a king that is known for his healing abilities. And we hear about a malady, a disease that basically is overcoming the populace. Again, this place filled with disease and corruption. And Malcolm says, "'Tis called the evil, a most miraculous work in this good king, which often, since my here remain in England, I've seen him do. How he solicits heaven, himself best knows. But strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye. The mere despair of surgery, he cures. Hanging a golden stamp about their necks, put on with holy prayers, and 'tis spoken to the succeeding royalty he leaves the healing benediction. With this strange virtue, he hath the heavenly gift of prophecy, and sundry blessings hang about his throne that speak in full of grace." And Lady Macbeth's very famous out damn spot. I can't help but think of Psych 101 textbooks, because this is the perfect example of obsessive compulsive disorder, where she can't wash away the guilt of her sins. And we hear that Macbeth is like wearing a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. Of course, these are stolen robes, and Macbeth's stature has been minimized over the course of the play, from a war hero to basically a traitor. And of course, he will suffer consequences for that. And we see how far Macbeth has fallen after he's told about Lady Macbeth's death, where he says, well, she should have died hereafter. In other words, yeah, it would have happened eventually. Remember, we started the play with her being his dearest partner in greatness. So the transformation is gigantic. Those are just a few of the quotes of Macbeth that I wanted to highlight for you. That's going to be today's attendance question, in fact. And the attendance question will be about which one is one of your favorite quotes in Macbeth and why. It could be a quote that I've cited, or it could be a quote that I have not cited. And that leads us to talking briefly about our next play. That happens to be Othello. The good news about Othello is that, first of all, it's our last play. So we've had a good amount of experience with reading. So I suspect that reading this play will be an easier exercise than reading some of the earlier works in the semester, just because you have more experience. And it's also a story we're familiar with, because Othello is basically Much Ado About Nothing, but with a very negative ending. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted us to read Much Ado About Nothing. And as you know, over the course of this semester, I've been talking about different kinds of productions that we could watch. What I wanted to do with Othello is to talk about audio, and that you may be familiar with Archangel Audios. They are very highly esteemed with professionally trained actors who read the plays, and we listen. We don't watch performance, we listen to performance, which actually would have been pretty common in Shakespeare's time if you were in the audience and you didn't have a good seat. That you may not necessarily have been able to see the action, but you could hear the action unfolding. Shakespeare's plays are really meant to be heard. And Shakespeare was quite aware of that we may not necessarily have gotten all of the visual cues that we needed, which is why there's so much dialogue and that's explanatory. So I thought what I would ask you to do today is to listen to approximately the first half hour. In fact, if you listen to Act 1, Scene 1 to Act 2, Scene 1, that would put you at minute 36:17. So today's class will run a little bit longer than what classes usually run, but I want to make sure that we've got enough time to be able to listen to the audio of Othello and also talk about Othello as well. Because the audio in its entirety is 3 hours long. We know that adaptations oftentimes cut elements so that the action will move more quickly. It can be rather challenging to sit through a performance, but in audio, it's assumed that you're not necessarily going to be consuming that in one sitting, though you certainly could if you wanted to. So I'm going to ask you to listen to the Archangel. We'll talk a little bit more about Archangel Othello and Othello in general over the next couple classes as we continue to listen to the audio. But at this point, my question to you is, which is one of your favorite quotes of Macbeth and why? That'll be due Friday the 28th at noon. Of course, if you need an extension, ask me. And of course, if you need additional time, please ask me as well. But we are headed towards the ending of the semester. And you're not required to read your classmates' responses, but or you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, I'm sorry, but do read your classmates' responses so that you can get a sense of what we would have talked about during class discussion. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with Othello. Bye-bye.